here on the screen. Now, the first question here on the screen says, discuss how wage rates are determined in perfect market, right? Now, if you remember, Preet, we talked about the idea that there are two types of labor markets, perfect labor market and imperfect labor market. Now, as the word suggests, what's perfect labor market? So perfect labor market is where, there are a lot of companies that are willing to hire labor, and there are a lot of people who are willing to work, right? Perfect labor market, right? So there's a lot of demand for workers from companies who are willing to hire, and there's a lot of supply of labor from people who are willing to work in that industry. This is making sense, right? So there is a lot of supply and a lot of demand from different people, right? So that's perfect labor market. And then there is something known as imperfect labor market. And what is imperfect labor market? Where, there is not a lot of firms willing to hire people, and there is not a lot of supply of labor, right? So that's imperfect labor market. Students, are you following me, right? So perfect labor market and imperfect labor market, right? Okay, now the question here says that how wages are set in perfect labor market, right? Exactly, where there's a huge number of labor available, like factories, workers, limited supply of labor, like accountants. Exactly, perfect, that's correct. Right? So Mubin, since you have just joined, so let me give you a quick overview of what we are doing in today's class. We will be doing past papers related to labor market. And if you not know this already, let me tell you that this is a very important topic from exam point of view. And every year, almost every year, you'll see one essay question related to labor market for 25 marks, right? So today and even tomorrow as well, we'll do a couple of questions related to this, so you get a better idea what type of questions are being asked and how you need to answer those. Okay, now the first question we are attempting here says, discuss how wage rates are determined in perfect labor market. So I was just giving you an overview, though we will discuss in detail right now, that there's perfect labor market and there's imperfect labor market. In perfect labor market, there is a lot of supply of labor. Supply is coming from people who are willing to work, and demand is coming from companies who are willing to hire, who demands labor, who want to have labor to get the work done. Yes or no, right? And who supplies labor? Labor is supplied by people who are willing to work, right? People like me, right? Or anyone else who wants to work in that country because they want to earn some money, as simple as that, right? So there's a lot of supply and demand for labor. Wages are determined through market forces of demand and supply, as we'll see in a bit. There is no government intervention, there is no exploitation going on, right? And so on and so forth. So we'll discuss all these things in this question, right? And on the other hand, imperfect labor market, as you can imagine, it's not perfect. So what's going on over here? Either there are limited number of firms who are willing to hire labor, or there is limited supply of labor who are willing to work. There is a lot of involvement of trade unions, like the platforms that represents workers, so they make it imperfect, or there is a lot of excessive involvement from the government, which makes it imperfect, right? So these are all the things that we'll talk about in both. I mean, government can technically intervene. That's a very good question. So Preet is asking if government can intervene in both. Technically can, yes. Government can intervene in both perfect and imperfect labor markets. But Preet, the government will not intervene in perfect labor market because it's already operating in a perfect manner. So the government doesn't need to, right? So no one is being exploited. Market forces are determining the wages of labor, and kind of people are happy, so they don't need to. But where do they need to intervene? That's imperfect labor market. Net, like imperfect labor market, NMW. So can you explain me, Preet, what do you mean by NMW? NMW is implemented, right? Okay, now how are wages determined in perfect labor market? Students, I want you to pay close attention, right? Now, perfect labor market, as I told you, we'll discuss about its, characteristics in a bit. But before that, we are coming to the main part, which is the graph, through which we will show how wages are determined in perfect labor market, right? Perfect labor market. Okay, so students, first thing that you have to do here is to show, just a second, sorry about that, you have to bear with me with this. Okay, now you will draw two graphs for perfect labor market, two graphs simultaneous to each other. One will show you what's happening in the industry, and the other one will show you what's happening in the firm, right? So industry is what? Industry is collection of firms, right? What is industry? Industry is collection of firms. Now have a look at this, students. So on the left, let's say we are making it for the industry, and on the right will show for the uh, firm, right? Sorry about that. Industry, and on the right, we're showing it for the firm, right? Okay, so just give me a minute and think where this. And on the left, we are showing it for the, just a second, and on the left graph will show what's happening in the firm, right? So that's for the firm, right? Okay, and that's for the industry. Okay, now students, have a look at this. So industry is collection of firms that make a certain market, right? So let's talk about a specific type of labor. Let's think about, you know, cab drivers. Let's think about cab drivers, right? So I'm sure whichever country you belong to, there are a couple of cab riding apps nowadays, right? So you would be familiar with Uber, you would be familiar with, you know, some other local, car pooling apps, right? And things like that, right? So what happens, basically, they require drivers to, you know, drive and to, you know, provide cab services to their customers. That's how it works, right? Now think about this. Industry will comprise of all the firms that are providing this app, or they're providing this cab service, right? So that could include Uber, that could include Lyft. I mean, if we talk about other Western countries, I don't think Lyft is available in countries like Pakistan, India, and China, but there will definitely be some local players. Like in Pakistan, there is Careem, and so on and so forth, right? So on the y-axis, you will have wages. Now, students, have a look at this. So on the y-axis of this industry graph, you will have wages that will show you that what would be the wage of this type of labor. On the x-axis, you will have quantity of labor. Students, is this making sense? Okay. Now, what you need to first of all draw on this graph is the downward sloping demand for labor, and upward sloping will be your supply of labor. Students, are you getting me? So upward sloping will be your supply of, sorry about that, upward sloping will be your supply of labor, like this. Okay, now first let's understand what this upward sloping supply is and what this downward sloping demand is, right? So upward sloping market supply of labor means this comprises of all the people who are willing to work as cab drivers. Now think about this. In our country, in one particular country, let's say Pakistan, all people who are willing to work as cab drivers and who are also eligible to do that, which means that they have their driving license, they have a car with them, because in most cases, these cab services require people to have their own car. So people who have their own car, who have a driving license, valid driving license, and you know, who are willing to work as cab drivers, they are the ones who are determining the supply of, who are determining the supply of drivers. On the other hand, who is determining the demand for cab drivers? The companies who want to hire these people, because their company or their services can't be provided unless they have cab drivers, right? So all the companies I was telling you, Uber and Lyft and, you know, Careem and whatever these companies are, right? So these companies together are determining the demand for labor. Now think about this, students. With the demand and supply of this type of labor is equal, that will be the market equilibrium. What would that be? That would be your market equilibrium. And what will this market equilibrium show you? This market equilibrium will show you the market wage, that how much wage will be provided to a typical cab driver, and how much quantity, Q1, how much quantity will be hired in the market. So this is total quantity. This could be, let's say, I don't know, 20 lakh, 20,000 or 22 lakh, or whatever the number is, right? 20,000 cab drivers are hired per month or per year, whatever, right? Okay, and what's the wage? That could be anything, right? So let's say a typical wage driver, cab driver in Pakistan earns, I don't know, let's say 50,000 rupees per month, right? Is this making sense, right, students? 50,000 rupees per month, right? Are we good? Can you move on? Okay. Now, this being said, now what do we show on the left-hand side? Is everyone clear on this, right? Students, are we clear on this? Is this making sense, right? Okay. Now, moving on to the right side of the graph, students will draw a similar graph, but that will only show you what's happening in the case of a firm, one firm, let's say Uber, right? So in the case of Uber, now think about this. Uber cannot afford to pay its workers anything less than what the market is paying. Now, students, listen to me very carefully. If we talk about one firm in this industry, so what is this industry we are talking about? This industry is the cab services industry we are talking about, which provides cab services to customers, right? Now, this industry comprises of a lot of players, Uber, Lyft, Careem, and so on and so forth. But if you think of one particular firm in this industry, let's say Uber, so what will happen in Uber's case, that's what we're looking at on the right-hand side of the graph under the firm category, right? Okay, now think about this. Is the car of the driver, he's employed or self-employed? Okay, Preet, yes. Most of the times the way it works, right? It's not the companies that are providing them the cars. So the idea, the mechanism, as I know, the way it works is, let's say I am a normal, individual. I might be working somewhere else as well, right? I have a car. So what I need to do, first of all, I need to register myself as a driver on this app. Then what they do, they ask me to bring my car to rate it, to see if that car is good enough and comfortable enough to be used as cab. And then they will look at my driving license. They will permit me to drive. And let's say they get all the background screening and everything is good. Then I'm registered as a driver on Uber or whichever app that might be, right? And then whenever I want to operate, as it's not compulsory that I drive my car 10 hours a day or 8 hours a day. That totally depends on my own convenience, right? So if I want to start my app tomorrow in the morning for 2 hours and then 2 hours in the evening, then that's perfectly up to me, right? So that's how it works. So in a way, you can say, it's not technically self-employed because you're providing services for someone else, but it's a very flexible nature. The nature of the job is very flexible. So you do it at your own convenience and on those times which suit you more, right? So that's how it works. Easy? Is this making sense? Okay, now students, have a look at this. Again, on the y-axis of the firm graph, you will have wages. On the y-axis of the graph, you will have wages. And on the x-axis of this graph, you will have quantity of labor that this firm will hire. So you will have quantity of labor, but only not for the entire market, not for the entire industry, students. So on the right, on the x-axis of this firm graph, you will only have the quantity of labor that this firm will hire. Students, are you following me? Right? Of labor. Okay, now think about this. Now, the idea is that whatever wages are determined in the market, each firm has to pay its drivers the same wage. Whatever wages are determined in the market, each firm has to pay its drivers the same wage. Why, students? Why? Because think about this. If Uber is paying its drivers something less than what Lyft and Careem, like what its competitors are paying, then why would any driver want to work at Uber and not go and work for their competitors? I repeat myself, right? So whatever wage is determined in the market, that's the competitive wage based on market forces of supply and demand. That same wage has to be paid by every firm in the industry. Why? Because if you're paying your workers, your drivers something less, they will leave and go and work for your competitors who are paying you more, right? Simple as that. So what we did in this graph, have a look at this one more time. So we extended the market wage rate on the right-hand side of the graph, and we made a straight horizontal line. So in a way, you can think of this as the supply. This is technically the supply, right? So supply of labor is perfectly, what do we call it? Perfectly elastic. Why is that? I'm writing it as SL, supply of labor for one firm. It's perfectly elastic because there are so many people who are willing to work as drivers. That's what it means to be perfectly elastic. And then you will draw then you will draw a downward sloping demand curve, right? So usually the way marginal revenue product of labor is drawn, so marginal revenue product of labor looks like this, right? Just a second. So marginal revenue product of labor looks like this, right? So this is your demand for labor by one firm. So downward sloping is the demand for labor, upward sloping is the supply of labor, as we have just seen. And where the demand and supply are equal, where the demand supply of labor are equal, students, that is the equilibrium point for the firm. And what will this equilibrium point show you? This equilibrium point will show you that how much will be the wage rate that this firm will pay, and what is the total quantity that this firm will hire, right? So out of, let's say, total of 20,000 workers, 20,000 drivers that the industry hires, 20,000 drivers is what the industry hires. This firm is only hiring 5,000 or 1/4 of it. Yes or no? Is this making sense, students? So that's how wages in perfect labor market are determined. Any confusion so far, students? Take a minute, think about this again, and ask me if there was anything that's not clear, anything you want to ask me again. Okay, if this is clear, students, then let's get back to our, you know, our question here. And the question is saying, discuss how wages are determined in perfect market, right? So let me take a screenshot of this question because we are also maintaining a document for later use, right? So this is the question. You come here, you post the question over here, right? Now we are doing A part. So for A part, what we would do, first of all, I will not write everything because we have already discussed the definitions and all, but I'm just giving you some bullet points as a map, as a roadmap as to what you write in the answer to this question. First of all, you have to define what perfect labor market is, right? Now, I'll give you some examples. I'll give you some example to understand how you define these terms. Perfect labor market is where there are a lot of to hire labor and supply of people willing to provide their labor services, right? Okay, nothing but this. Perfect has following characteristics, right? Now, what are these characteristics? First one, we have already discussed that there are a lot of firms who are willing to hire labor. They determine the demand for labor. And there are a lot of people who are willing to supply labor, right? And who supplies labor? The people who are willing to work, right? Who are eligible to work, who are above the age of 18, who are mentally and physically fit, and who are willing to work, right? So these are all the people who supply labor, right? Now that was the first characteristic. Second characteristic says that firms are price takers or wage takers, which means, and let's put it like this, which means that whatever wage is sources of supply of labor, each firm will pay its workers same wage. Students, are you following me or not, right? So this is the point that I explained you on the graph, that each firm is wage taker. Now, what do we mean by wage taker? That whatever wage is prevailing in the market, that is the wage that they pay to their workers. Because if they pay something less, what will their workers do? They will leave for another company. Does this help, students? Is this simple? Okay. Okay. Then another characteristic that you need to understand is that there is intervention as no firm or worker is being exploited, and therefore government does not need to regulate the market. That's what I explained. Uh, Another thing that you need to know for perfect labor market, that there is absence of labor unions. So labor unions don't exist, right? Therefore, the government does not feel the need to regulate the market, right? Absence of labor unions, labor is homogeneous, which means that workers possess similar skills and therefore they all paid similar wages. Students, are you following me or not? And last of all is the labor is mobile, which means that people can switch between occupations and other areas for jobs, right? And that's the last characteristic. Okay, students, let's do a quick recap before we move forward here, right? So what are the characteristics of perfect labor market? So perfect labor market is where there are a lot of firms willing to hire people, and there are a lot of people who are willing to work. First thing. Second thing, there's no government intervention. Why? Because no one is being exploited and the government does not feel the need to regulate the market. Third, there's absence of trade unions. We'll talk more about trade unions later on, but trade unions are an organization that represents their workers, right? That represents workers who are their members basically, because they want to protect their rights, like in terms of making sure that they get high wages, they're not being exploited, they get enough days off, they have safe working environments where they work and things like that, right? Okay, then labor is homogeneous, which means that the skills that this labor possesses are very similar, right? And therefore everyone is more or less paid the same wage, right? And then another thing that you need to remember, that labor is mobile, which means that labor can switch between occupations, move from one occupation to another, and it can also move to different areas for work, right? So these are all the things that you need to remember. Is there any confusion, students? Anything else? Right? Okay, after you've explained what perfect labor market is, then explain how wages are determined market. So I'm just giving you this as the thinking point, through market forces of demand and supply, and whatever wage rate is determined like this will be the supply of labor for each firm, right? That's exactly what I showed you on the graph, right? So first of all, you draw the industry graph on the left, and on that industry graph, you draw the upward sloping market supply of labor and the downward sloping market demand for labor. Yes or no, right? And wherever the two intersect, that is your equilibrium point, and that equilibrium point will show you the wage that each labor will earn and what's the total quantity that will be hired in the market, right? 20,000, right? And then you extend this wage rate on the graph to the right, and then you draw a straight horizontal line like this, right? And then this is the supply of labor. So I did tell you that there's a lot of supply of labor. So each firm has perfectly elastic supply. So at this wage rate, whatever quantity of labor you want to hire, you can hire, right? What does perfectly elastic wage supply means? So perfectly elastic supply, students, means that at a certain wage rate, you can hire as many quantity of labor as much you wish to, right? So it's a straight horizontal line, and what it will show you basically is that at this particular wage rate, whatever it is, 50,000 rupees, 60,000 rupees, or whatever, right? You can hire as much quantity of labor as much you wish to, right? So whether you want to hire Q1 or you want to hire Q2 or you want to hire Q3, right? So you can hire any quantity of labor at this wage rate, right? Easy. Are you following me, students? So that's what it shows you, right? Okay. Sorry about that. This is Q2, right? You can hire whatever quantity you want to, and then similarly for Q3 and so on and so forth, right? Okay, now this being said, now where the demand curve for an individual firm, will intersect with the supply curve, where the demand curve of this firm will intersect with this supply curve, that is the equilibrium point for the firm, and that will determine how much quantity will be hired by this particular firm at the same wage rate. And this is the same wage rate. Students, do remember, this is the same wage rate. It's not any different, right? Which is being paid in the market. So every firm is paying the same wages to its workers, because I did tell you, if you're paying something less, then your workers will leave to work for other companies, right? Easy, we good on this? Okay, now students, that was the first question. Okay, now moving on to the B part of the question. The B part here says, if the labor market is imperfect, is the determination of wage rate still better left to that market? I repeat the question. If the labor market is imperfect, is the determination of wage rates still better left to that market? Now, what the question is trying to ask you, that if it's an imperfect labor market, should wage determination still be done by that market itself, or should the government intervene? That's what the question is asking for. Let me repeat the question here, students. So the question here says, if the labor market is imperfect, is the determination of wage rate still better left to that market? So in simple words, the question is saying that if it's an imperfect market, should the wage rate still be determined by the market, or should government intervene in the market to determine the wage rates, right? Now, this is what we're about to discuss. So first of all, what you need to do is to briefly define imperfect labor market. Right? Now, what is imperfect labor market? Does anyone know? I did give you some idea, but I'll explain you in more detail. Imperfect labor market is where there is limited demand for labor because of few and or limited supply of labor due to few people willing to work, right? So that's the first thing that you need to write. Limited labor and supplies. Yeah, that's correct. Very good, Mubi, right? Right? Okay, now just a second. Preet, did you say where supply or demand is in surplus? You're talking about imperfect labor market, Preet? And what do we mean? What do you mean when you say surplus, where demand or supply is in surplus? I mean, more than surplus, I would say it's limited, Preet. Because think about this: when something is in surplus, that means it's in abundance, and when something is in abundance, right, then you don't need to worry about it, right? Yeah. Okay, they're not in equilibrium. Yeah. We'll see, right? So just stay with me and I'll show you how wages are determined in imperfect labor markets, and why is that a problem for the government, and then what the government does about it, right? Okay, now think about this. Imperfect labor market is where there's limited demand for labor because of few firms willing to hire, and or limited supply of labor due to few people willing to work, right? After this, you can say imperfect labor markets have following characteristics, right? Now, what are these characteristics we're about to have a look at this, right? So the first one is few firms willing to hire, or few people who are willing to work. Then another thing that you need to know, that wages are not determined solely by market forces of demand, supply, and instead other factors are also wages, like existence of trade union, government intervention, right? firms and workers gaining powers. Okay, students, so let's first understand this characteristic that I've written here, right? Okay. Now, unlike perfect labor market, where wages are solely determined by the market force of demand supply, how much is the demand for labor, how much is the supply, where the demand supply intersect, that's what the equilibrium in perfect labor market is. But that's not how it works in imperfect labor markets. In case of imperfect labor markets, wages are not determined solely by market force of demand supply, and instead other factors are also important in determining wages, like the existence of trade union, and we'll see in a bit how that works. Government intervention, right? So if government intervenes, government might set some of its own rules and policies that firms have to follow, right? And then firms and workers bargaining powers. Now, what is a bargaining power? Bargaining power means how much influence you have over someone else, right? So if labor has more bargaining power because there are fewer people who are willing to work, right, they can negotiate higher wages. And if firms have more bargaining power, this means that there are fewer firms in the market, then they can ask for higher wages. Are you getting me, right? Okay, now students, after this, what's the next thing that you need to know, right? Right? Okay. Labor does not homogeneous skills. Again, this is unlike perfect market. This is unlike in perfect labor market. If you remember, I told you that labor has homogeneous skills, like their skills are very similar, right? All people know, they have more or less same skills, and it's each person is equally good. Each person is equally good, right? But if it's an imperfect labor market, so what that means that labor does not has homogeneous skills, which means some people deserve more wages than others based on skill set, right? Is everyone clear on this? Okay, so now that's another thing that you need to know, right? So some people have better skills than other people. Okay, that being said, right, and then we talked about presence of trade union, government intervention. So that's about it. And the last one is that labor is immobile. Do you know what immobile means? Like not easily movable, which means it is hard to switch between occupations and area jobs, right? So that's another thing that you need to remember. Geographical difficulties, exactly, very nice, right? So what it means to be geographically immobile, that it's not easy for someone living in India to move from Delhi to Mumbai for jobs. Similarly, vice versa, right? And similarly, if labor is immobile in Pakistan, that means it's not very easy for someone working or living in Islamabad to go and work in Karachi, Lahore, or some other city of Pakistan, and so on. But if that's the opposite, which means that labor is mobile, then it's relatively easy for labor to switch between cities and even to switch between occupations. Like if I'm a teacher right now, I can switch to become a manager. If I'm working in marketing right now, then it's easy for me to go and work in sales or finance or something else, so on. Okay, is this making sense? Now, just a quick recap and then move forward. So right now we've just seen that in perfect labor market, whatever characteristics were there, complete opposite characteristics exist in imperfect labor markets. In perfect labor market, we said that wages are solely determined on market force of demand supply, and we did saw that. In case of imperfect labor market, we said that wages are not solely determined on market forces. Instead, there are other factors, external influences, as we say, external factors that affect wages. Presence of trade union, presence of government intervention, and bargaining power, which which market participant, meaning the firms or the labor has more bargaining power over the other group, right? And labor is not homogeneous. Labor does not have homogeneous skills, right? Which means that some people are better, they have more skills, and some people are not that good, and therefore different wages could be offered to each one of them. And last of all is that labor is not mobile, right? Immobile, which means it's not very easy to switch between occupations and jobs. Okay, now let's first talk about types of imperfect Now, types of imperfect labor markets include first one, which is the most popular case, is of monopsony market. Now, what's monopsony market? I'll explain you, right? Then another thing that you need to know is presence of trade union, and the last one is existence of government intervention. Or you can simply write this down as government intervention, right? Okay, now students, have a look at this. So these are three possible types of imperfect labor markets. The first one where monopsony market exists, where it's a monopsony. The second one is where trade unions exist, and the third one is where there is government intervention. Okay, now moving on to the first case here, monopsony. Now, what's a monopsony market? I'll explain you in a bit, but monopsony market is where there is a single, employer. Now, there's a difference between students. There's a difference between monopoly and monopsony. You are already familiar with the word monopoly. Monopoly is in product market. Monopoly is in product market, students. Please remember this. Monopoly was when there's single producer of the firm. What do we mean by single producer of the firm? When there's only one firm that produces a certain product, right? So that was monopoly. But now we are talking about monopsony. Monopsony is where there is single employer. There's only one firm. I don't know why this is not right in just a second. Monopsony. Okay, forget about it, right? So let me explain it over here and then we'll come back. Okay, so what's monopsony? Have a look at this. Monopsony is a labor market with single employer. Now, what do we mean by single employer? Which means that there's only one company, that there is one firm which is willing to hire a certain type of labor. Certain type of labor. This is making sense? With a single employer, which means that there's only one firm which is willing to hire a certain type of labor. Okay, now this being said, students, we'll move on and we'll talk about how wages are determined in the monopsony market. So for that, we need to look at the graph, right? So have a look at this. Now, this might be a little tricky for you, but should not be very difficult to understand, right? So what you have to do, first of all, you'll draw, a simple graph like this, right? Where your label, first of all, you label the axes, right? So on the y-axis, students, you have wages, and on the x-axis, you have quantity of labor, like always, right? So you have quantity of labor. So on the y-axis, you have wages, right? So you have wages on the y-axis, and you have quantity of labor on the x-axis. You have quantity of labor, quantity of labor on the x-axis. Okay, now think about this. In this monopsony graph, you will first of all draw two graphs. The downward sloping will be the demand curve like this, right? So downward sloping will be the demand curve like this, and then you will have an upward sloping supply curve like this. Now you have to pay close attention. Now this supply of labor is also the average cost of labor. So I label it as AC, average cost of labor, equals SL, supply of labor. And this downward sloping graph that I've made, that will be DL, demand for labor. This is making sense, students, right? Then what happens in a perfectly competitive market that we just saw, students? What happens in a perfectly competitive market, that upward sloping is the supply of labor, downward sloping is demand for labor. Wherever the two intersect, that is the equilibrium in perfectly competitive market. So I will also show you what happens in perfectly competitive market so that we can compare it with the monopsony. So for now, I'm just identifying what happens in a perfectly competitive market. So in perfectly competitive market, where the supply and demand for labor exists, that's the equilibrium point. That shows you how much will be the wage and how much will be the wages of labor, right? So WC, competitive market. WC means that what's happened, what's the case in competitive market, and QC meaning quantity that will be hired in competitive market. Easy, we good on this? Okay. But then in monopsony, what happens that there is another thing that's known marginal cost of labor. What is that called? That's called marginal cost of labor. So that will lie to the left of supply of labor. Marginal cost of labor lies to the left of supply of labor or the average cost of labor. Easy, we got on this. So this is MC, marginal cost of labor. Now in monopsony, now listen to this carefully, students, where the marginal cost of labor intersects with the demand for labor. That is the